If they had known who she really was, they would have lowered their guns. But by the time they found out, it was already too late. The two-lane highway that curved gently through the outskirts of Augusta, Georgia, was mostly quiet at 11:45 p.m. A cool breeze blew in from the south, rustling the leaves as the streetlights cast broken shadows across the asphalt. A black luxury SUV glided silently under their dim glow. Inside sat Angela Carter, 48, her fingers resting calmly on the steering wheel. The soft light from the dashboard painted her face in gentle gold and green hues. She wasn't rushing. She never did. Angela had just concluded a week of intense negotiations in Washington, D.C., serving as a senior trade advisor for the Department of Commerce. Her focus had been on the proposed reciprocal tariffs outlined by President Donald Trump, which aimed to impose equivalent tariffs on countries that taxed American goods unfairly. These policies were set to impact international trade dynamics significantly. The proposed changes had sparked heated debates on Capitol Hill, with commerce officials, including Angela, working tirelessly to address concerns from both sides of the aisle. The administration aimed to implement tariffs that would match those imposed by other nations, ensuring a level playing field for American businesses. Angela was calm, focused. She hadn't missed a signal. She wasn't speeding. Her license was up to date, insurance too. Everything was by the book. But deep down, she knew. In this country, being a black woman driving a nice car at night sometimes meant the book didn't matter. Her rearview mirror lit up with flashing red and blue. Angela's foot eased off the gas. She turned on her blinker, moved carefully to the shoulder of the road, and exhaled. Her hands remained on the wheel, her breathing even. She'd done nothing wrong. But that had never been enough. Not always. A patrol car pulled in behind her. Two white officers stepped out, their silhouettes sharp under the strobing lights. One was short and wide-shouldered, his crew cut stark under the beam. The other was tall, angular, with a narrowed gaze that flickered with suspicion. Angela watched them through the side mirror as they approached. She didn't reach for anything. She simply rolled the window halfway and waited. The short one knocked hard on the glass with his flashlight. "License and registration," he barked. Angela offered a polite, level tone. "May I ask what I was pulled over for, officer?" "You didn't signal during a lane change," he replied, voice clipped. That was a lie. She had. But Angela had no interest in arguing. She moved slowly, deliberately opening the glove box, retrieving her documents. Her motions were rehearsed. Every black parent in America had taught their children how to do this. She handed them over. The officer grabbed them without looking. "Step out of the vehicle." Angela blinked. "Excuse me?" "Out. Now." The taller officer, Brendan Cole, she would later learn, stepped to the passenger side and leaned in, scanning the interior like he was hunting for something illegal. "This your car?" he asked with a sneer. "Yes, it is." He chuckled. "Paid for it with food stamps, huh?" Angela's jaw tensed slightly. She didn't take the bait. She'd heard worse from men who held higher ranks. "Step out," the shorter cop ordered again, now resting a hand on his firearm. Angela unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped onto the shoulder. The pavement was cold beneath her shoes, the air damp with southern spring. The highway was still. No other cars, no witnesses. "Hands on your head." Angela obeyed. "Now, down on your knees." She stared at the man. "I'm not resisting, officer. But why am I being—" The metallic click of a gun echoed in the stillness. He had drawn it, pointed it straight at her head. Angela had commanded teams in high-stakes negotiations. She had been in rooms where decisions impacted entire industries. But nothing felt as insulting as this. To be seen not as a citizen, not as a woman, not even as a person, but as a threat. She went to her knees, not out of fear, but because she knew they were waiting for a reason, any excuse to fire. The tall one circled her like a predator. What's in the car? You hiding something? Guns? Drugs? No, sir. They opened her car door and began pulling things out. Her laptop bag, her documents, her Commerce Department badge still tucked inside her leather case. One officer tossed her folders onto the floor. Another grabbed her phone, scrolled, then tossed it aside with a grunt. Angela said nothing. Stubborn little lady, Cole muttered. What's your deal? She met his gaze. You are violating my rights. The stocky one, Mark Dalton, laughed. You think quoting some liberal blog is going to help you? Angela's voice was steady. I'd like to make a phone call. Dalton looked amused. Who are you calling, Oprah? Angela didn't smile. Number just an old friend at the White House. They snorted, sure you are. She reached slowly, painfully slow, and pulled a slim, matte black phone from inside her jacket. She dialed. One ring. A deep, measured voice answered. General Anderson. Sir, she said softly. It's Angela Carter. I'm currently being detained, at gunpoint, by 2 officers on Route 25 near the Richmond County line. No probable cause, no warrant. Silence. Then, are you safe? I'm kneeling on the side of the road, sir. I'll handle it. Angela ended the call. The officers stared. Dalton raised an eyebrow. What the hell was that? Angela looked directly at them. The beginning of your reassignment. Seconds later, Dalton's radio crackled. Unit 4, stand down. You are detaining a senior government official. Release her immediately. That's an order. Dalton froze. Angela stood, brushed dirt from her knees, and reached into her blazer again. This time, pulling out her government ID. Gold embossed. Steel lettering. Angela Carter, Senior Trade Advisor, Department of Commerce. Cole's smirk was gone. Dalton's hand trembled slightly. Neither said a word. And Angela? She simply stood there, taller than any of them could ever be. What do you think about how Angela handled this situation? What would you have done if you were in her position? Angela didn't speak as she stood tall in the glow of the patrol car's lights. Her blazer was dusted with dirt, her trousers creased at the knees where she'd knelt, but her composure was untouched. She held the ID card steady in her hand, letting the 2 officers get a good look at it. The gold seal of the Department of Commerce shimmered faintly under the red and blue flashing lights. Officer Dalton's face was pale, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Cole, the taller one, had stepped back a half pace as if the badge itself were radioactive. Angela saw it, how quickly their authority had dissolved into unease. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. That wasn't her style. You had no reason to pull me over, she said calmly. No probable cause, no warrant. And now, no cover. Dalton opened his mouth, then closed it again. His voice, when it came, was thin and unconvincing. We didn't know who you were. Angela turned to him, her eyes steady. And if I were just a black woman on her way home from work? What then? Still end up at gunpoint? Cole shifted his weight, muttered something under his breath. Angela didn't ask him to repeat it. She took a step toward her car. I'm retrieving my phone. Slowly. I'd like you to stay exactly where you are. The men said nothing. She opened her door, reached into the back seat, and retrieved her phone and laptop bag. Inside were confidential documents, proposals for reciprocal tariffs, internal assessments, and a copy of her personal notes from a strategy meeting with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. She placed the phone to her ear again. Sir, it's Angela. They've stood down. I'm safe. General Anderson's voice was firm, clipped. I've already spoken with Internal Affairs. Expect backup within minutes. Stay put. Copy that. She ended the call. The night air hung heavy with tension, thick with things left unsaid. Far in the distance, A new set of headlights appeared, moving fast. Angela didn't need to guess. It was protocol now. The car pulled in smoothly behind the patrol unit, lights flashing but no siren. From it stepped two men in dark windbreakers with silver lettering, Internal Affairs. Behind them was a third figure, taller, broader, with a weathered face and silver hair beneath a black police cap. Chief Raymond Harper. His presence sucked the heat from the air. Dalton and Cole straightened like schoolboys caught smoking behind the gym. Harper's eyes scanned the scene quickly, Angela standing composed. The two officers rattled. The open car door, the disheveled paperwork. Then his gaze landed on the ID card still in Angela's hand. He stepped forward. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Angela gave a single nod. "I'm unharmed, Chief, but we need to talk." Harper turned to Dalton and Cole. "Do you two know what you've done?" Dalton's voice cracked. "Chief, we didn't realize—" "It doesn't matter who she is," Harper cut in. "It matters what you did, and it's all on camera." One of the Internal Affairs agents stepped forward, tapping a device on his vest. "Body cam sync complete. We've got it all, from the first stop to the radio call." Cole rubbed his forehead like trying to erase the last half hour from his memory. Harper turned to Angela. "We'll take your statement, and I apologize, on behalf of this department and this city." Angela's lips pressed into a line. "An apology won't undo the damage. And this isn't the first time it's happened, just the first time you got caught with the wrong target." Harper nodded grimly. "We'll begin a full review, immediate suspension for both officers. We'll do this by the book." He gestured to the Internal Affairs agents, who flanked Dalton and Cole like prison guards. Neither officer resisted. They had no ground left to stand on. Angela waited until the officers were taken aside before she returned to her car. She sat behind the wheel, her fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel for a long moment. Her breath came out in one slow stream. Her phone buzzed with a message from Anderson. "Incident escalating to federal review. Secretary informed. Prepare to debrief Monday." She closed her eyes. All she had wanted was to get home, just one night of quiet. And now she was a headline waiting to happen. Over the next 48 hours, the story swept across state lines. It started small, an anonymous post on a community forum, then a Facebook video of the flashing lights. But once local media got wind of Angela's identity, the narrative exploded. "Senior government official detained at gunpoint in Georgia" blared across news crawlers. CNN ran the footage. Fox demanded context. MSNBC ran a deep dive on racial profiling in the South. Angela didn't watch any of it. She spent Saturday morning in her kitchen, sipping coffee, answering emails from DC, and ignoring her vibrating phone. Offers came in. Morning shows, op-eds, interviews. She declined them all. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. She was interested in results. By Monday, she was back in Washington, seated in a conference room at the Department of Commerce, a steaming cup of Earl Grey in front of her, 3 thick folders to her right, and a conference line blinking on mute. Her colleagues entered with solemn nods, more cautious now, more aware. No one mentioned what had happened, but they all knew. She was scheduled to present revised tariff response models based on recent G7 deliberations. She clicked her laptop open, looked at the data, and for a second, just one, her eyes drifted toward the window. The Capitol dome shimmered in the distance. She exhaled, pressed unmute, and began her report. Her voice was as clear and steady as it had been on that dark road. Later that afternoon, she met with a small delegation from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. They wanted her story, not for the cameras, but for the record. Angela relayed it with precision, without embellishment. Every gesture, every word spoken by the officers, every moment of silence in between. "Do you want to press charges?" one of them asked. Angela paused. "Number." "But I want something written into policy. I want field officers across this country to receive advanced training in bias identification and de-escalation. I want those body cams reviewed quarterly. I want this incident to matter, not just for me, but for the next black woman who gets pulled over and can't call a general." The man across from her leaned back in his chair, his fingers laced together. "That's reasonable," he said, "but it won't be easy." Angela smiled, the kind of smile forged through years of being told what couldn't be done. "If I wanted easy, I'd have chosen a different job." That evening, she walked home through the quiet streets of Capitol Hill. Cherry blossoms had begun to fall, their petals floating through the air like pieces of silk. The city was beautiful in spring, but she knew better than to be charmed by its surface. She knew its weight. She carried it with her. And though she walked alone, she walked taller than she ever had. Because now, the truth wasn't just in her voice. It was in the system, etched into reports, logged in video, confirmed by silence and by sound. And that meant something. Not everything, but something. By midweek, Angela's name was on every desk in the West Wing. The incident that began as a routine traffic stop had become a national firestorm. Cable networks debated the racial undertones of power and perception. Trade publications noted with irony that the same woman helping to negotiate global tariffs had nearly been shot on a highway for doing nothing but driving home. The president himself, amid heated discussions over retaliatory tariffs against Europe and China, was briefed on her status. When his chief of staff mentioned Angela Carter's name, he paused and said, "Isn't she the one heading reciprocal trade strategy?" That was all it took. The story, once confined to social media, now traveled through formal political channels, tangled up with national identity, race relations, and America's place in the global market. Back in Augusta, things were unraveling fast. Body cam footage had been released to the public. Angela's calm voice, the officer's aggressive tones, and the unmistakable sound of a gun cocking. These were not images that could be easily walked back. Citizens protested outside the police precinct. Former officers began coming forward about the culture of unchecked power inside the department. And Chief Harper, a man who'd spent 3 decades trying to balance enforcement with community trust, now found himself walking a tightrope with no net beneath him. Angela hadn't spoken publicly. She still answered calls from federal officials and civil rights leaders, but she kept the media at bay. She believed the work spoke louder than a podium ever could. Yet pressure kept mounting. The DOJ wanted her to participate in a national task force on police reform. The Commerce Secretary invited her to speak at a closed-door conference on racial bias in federal leadership. Universities reached out, offering honorary degrees. Even her alma mater in Atlanta asked her to give the commencement speech. But through it all, she kept returning to the same question. Would any of this have happened if she hadn't had the right name, the right title, the right number in her contact list? And what about those who didn't? One evening, just as dusk settled over the district, Angela stood in her modest Georgetown apartment, sipping tea as a local news anchor described a growing petition demanding that Officers Cole and Dalton not only be dismissed, but charged. She muted the TV. The petition had nearly 1 million signatures. People were angry. But anger alone didn't fix systems. It fueled them briefly, then left people burnt out, and wondering what had changed. She thought about a conversation she'd had years ago with a trade partner from Canada. "You don't fight fire with fire," the woman had said. "You build a fire break, something that stands strong between destruction and hope." Angela wasn't sure she believed in hope as easily as she used to, but she believed in structure. She believed in plans. And she believed that if a system could be weaponized, it could also be reformed. piece by piece, clause by clause, training by training. The next morning, she met with Secretary Ramirez in a quiet, secured conference room near the Eisenhower Executive Office building. He was cordial, thoughtful, and genuinely concerned. He'd seen the footage. "You didn't flinch," he said. "Not once." She gave a tired smile. "Flinching gets you shot." He asked what she wanted, truly wanted. She laid it out with the same precision she used when preparing trade responses. A federal mandate requiring all police departments to undergo quarterly external audits on traffic stops involving minorities. Nationwide use of de-escalation simulators in officer training. A federally funded task force that reported directly to the DOJ, staffed with professionals outside of law enforcement to monitor abuse of power. And most of all, real consequences. Not just suspensions, but disqualifications. Permanent records, visibility. "We track steel imports more aggressively than we track civil rights violations," she said quietly. Ramirez nodded. "It's time we change that." When she walked out of the building, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt ready. Word came 3 days later. The president had read her recommendations. A press conference was scheduled. She wasn't required to attend, but her name would be mentioned. That evening, Angela sat alone on a bench near the tidal basin, watching the cherry blossoms drift like memories over the water. Tourists passed by in groups, laughing, pointing at monuments, unaware of the woman in the dark blazer with the badge clipped to her belt. Her phone buzzed. General Anderson. "They want you to speak," he said without preamble. "Not as a victim, as an architect." She closed her eyes. "I'm not sure people are ready to hear it from me." "Angela," he said firmly, "you didn't survive this to go back to silence." She said nothing for a while, then nodded to herself. "All right, I'll do it. But it has to be real. No edits, no teleprompters." A week later, she stood at a podium in front of a small but packed auditorium at the Wilson Center, flanked by government officials, trade advisors, and law enforcement leaders. The air inside was still. Cameras whirred quietly at the back. She began not with outrage, not with policy, but with a story. Her story. Of that night on the highway. Of the fear she refused to show. Of the decision to kneel not in surrender, but to survive. She didn't accuse. She didn't attack. She simply told the truth, and let it land where it would. Then she pivoted, seamlessly, into recommendations. Evidence, data, policy, a roadmap. The room, quiet at first, leaned in. By the time she finished, the applause didn't erupt. It unfolded, slowly, rising like dawn. That night, Angela walked to her car alone. A young black woman in her 20s, clearly waiting outside for her, approached hesitantly. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you. My brother was stopped last year. No body cam. No call to make. We buried him 3 months later." Angela looked her in the eye, feeling the gravity of every name that never made it to the news. "You shouldn't have had to." She reached out, took the young woman's hand, and held it. "You stay loud, all right? Loud and brave." The sun was setting when Angela drove down Constitution Avenue, the orange sky casting long shadows across the city she served. The scars of that night in Georgia hadn't disappeared. They never would. But something else had emerged in their place. A new blueprint. One not drafted in anger, but in clarity, in resilience, in the unshakable belief that justice isn't about power. It's about principle, and sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stand your ground, make the call, and never look away. It started with a simple mistake, the kind that should have been harmless. A quick description, a hasty assumption, and a single red baseball cap. That was all it took to turn Trevin Jackson's ordinary afternoon into a nightmare. It was a warm evening in Chicago's South Side, the kind where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on, and families gathered on porches to escape the lingering summer heat. Trevon, a 13-year-old with a love for basketball and an easygoing nature, had only stopped at the corner store for a bottle of soda. He had done nothing wrong. But miles away, a different story was unfolding. A thief had just snatched a wallet from a tourist near Washington Park, disappearing before anyone could react. Witnesses scrambled to describe him. A young black boy, maybe 12 or 13, wearing a red cap. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the police scanner to echo the alert through the city. Not far from where Trevon strolled, Officer Greg Larson, a young cop barely 2 years into the force, stood inside a 7-Eleven, responding to a call about a petty theft. The store clerk, still rattled, described the suspect as a young black male in a dark hoodie and basketball shorts, though the details were vague. Larson, fueled more by assumption than evidence, scanned the streets outside the store with sharp eyes. When he spotted Trevon walking by, the pieces fell into place. Not because Trevon actually fit the description, but because he was the easiest target. The moment Larson stepped out onto the sidewalk, his focus locked onto Trevon like a predator zeroing in on prey. Trevon was oblivious at first, too caught up in the rhythm of his surroundings, the chatter of families on their porches, the hum of cars passing, the distant beats of music playing from an open window. But then he noticed the heavy footsteps behind him, the sharp energy of someone closing in fast. Before he could fully register the presence of the officer, Larson raised his can of pepper spray and, without warning, unleashed a burning mist directly into Trevon's face. The pain was instant, searing through his eyes and nose like fire. Trevon let out a choked gasp, his hands flying to his face as his vision blurred, his world shrinking to nothing but blinding agony. His backpack slipped from his shoulder and hit the ground with a soft thud, forgotten as he stumbled backward, struggling to breathe. The acrid burn of the spray mixed with his tears, making it impossible to see anything around him. Panic surged through his body like a bolt of electricity. He didn't understand what was happening, why he was being attacked, why the world had suddenly turned against him. His voice cracked as he tried to speak. Why? What did I do? But the only response was a rough hand yanking his arm, forcing him upright. His body trembled as he tried to pull away, but Larson's grip only tightened. "Stop resisting," the officer barked, his voice filled with the kind of authority that drowned out reason. Trevon wasn't resisting. He was just trying to stay on his feet, to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. He barely registered the murmurs of onlookers, the hesitant stares of strangers frozen in place. Some clutched their phones, recording but not intervening. Others simply turned away, unwilling to get involved. Larson didn't hesitate as he dragged Trevon toward the patrol car parked at the curb. The boy's legs barely moved beneath him, his knees buckling with every step. The pain, the fear, the sheer disbelief of what was happening paralyzed him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his chest tightening as he struggled against the crushing weight of panic. He tried to explain himself, his voice hoarse and desperate. I was coming from the basketball court. I didn't do anything." The officer didn't listen. He had already decided Trevon was guilty. The car door yanked open, and before Trevon could brace himself, Larson shoved him inside. He landed hard on the worn leather seat, the smell of sweat and metal filling his nose, his hands still clawing at his burning eyes. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the streets like a judge's gavel sealing his fate. From the window, Trevon caught a glimpse of his backpack still lying abandoned on the sidewalk. The zipper slightly open, one of his textbooks poking out. The car started moving. The city blurred past, indifferent to the boy inside who had just lost any sense of safety he once had. Trevon pressed his forehead against the window, his body shaking with quiet, painful sobs. He couldn't see where they were going, couldn't even think beyond the fire in his eyes and the fear gripping his chest. All he knew was that everything had changed in an instant. and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The police station felt nothing like the world Trevon knew. The moment he was shoved out of the patrol car, everything changed. The streetlights outside still glowed, cars still passed, and people still walked by. But inside these walls, there was nothing but cold air, harsh fluorescent lights, and a silence that made him feel smaller with every step. The officer leading him didn't speak. He only yanked Trevon forward, forcing the boy to move quickly or risk being dragged. His wrists weren't cuffed, but he felt like they might as well have been. His vision was still hazy, the pepper spray leaving an unbearable sting in his eyes. But no one had given him water. No one had asked if he was okay. He had stopped expecting kindness. They led him down a narrow hallway, lined with doors that all looked the same. Dull gray metal with small windows that revealed nothing inside. When Larson finally stopped, he pulled open one of the heavy doors and pushed Trevon inside. The room was even colder than the rest of the station, the air thick with the smell of old coffee and something metallic. The walls were bare except for a single clock ticking above the door, and in the center sat a table with 2 chairs, one of which had its metal legs scuffed from years of use. Trevon's legs trembled as he hesitated at the doorway, his breath still shaky, before he could decide whether to sit or stand. Larson gave him a shove toward the chair. "Sit," the officer ordered, his voice sharp. Trevon obeyed, gripping the edges of his hoodie like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. He had never been in a police station before, had never even imagined himself in a place like this. He was supposed to be at home, eating dinner with his mom, probably joking about how he had nearly beaten his friend Miles at basketball. Instead, he was here, in this dimly lit room, his skin still burning from the pepper spray, his heart pounding with fear he had never known before. Larson took his time before speaking. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Trevon like he was waiting for the boy to break. Trevon avoided his gaze, staring at the clock instead, counting the seconds. Finally, Larson spoke. "Tell me why you ran." Trevon frowned. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "I didn't run." "Don't lie to me." Larson pulled out the other chair and sat down across from him, leaning in slightly. "We got a report about a robbery. You match the description." Trevon's heart clenched. "I was coming from the basketball court," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sure you were." Larson tilted his head, his expression unreadable, like he was studying Trevon as if he were a puzzle missing the right pieces. "So what did you take?" "I didn't take anything," Trevon said, gripping his hoodie tighter. Larson sighed heavily, shaking his head as if this were all some big inconvenience to him. "Look, kid, you might think you can fool me, but I know your type." Those words stung. Your type. Trevon knew exactly what Larson meant. He had heard those words before from store clerks who followed him around the aisles, from neighbors who clutched their purses tighter when he walked by, from teachers who looked at him differently than they did the white kids in his class. Larson continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You were in the area. You fit the description. If you confess now, things will be easier for you." Trevon's throat tightened. "I didn't do anything." Larson exhaled sharply. "Kids like you, always causing trouble, always making things harder than they need to be." The room suddenly felt smaller. Trevon could feel the weight of it pressing against him, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, to fight back, to tell this man that he wasn't some criminal, that he was just a kid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Nothing he said would matter. Larson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Fine," he muttered. "You don't want to talk? We can do this the hard way." He turned toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. But before he could touch it, the door swung open. A tall, commanding figure stepped inside, and the energy in the room shifted instantly. He was older, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his uniform crisp and adorned with badges. Captain Daryl Jackson. Trevon's breath hitched. Even through his blurry vision, he recognized that voice. His father. Larson straightened instinctively, the confidence in his stance faltering for the first time. Captain Jackson, Jackson's eyes swept over the room, his gaze locking onto his son. His usually steady expression darkened as he took in Trevon's appearance. His red, puffy eyes, the dried streaks of tears on his cheeks, the way his shoulders were hunched in defeat. His gaze then snapped to Larson, and his anger became something almost tangible in the air. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was low, controlled, but it carried a weight that made the walls seem to shrink inward. Larson hesitated. "There was a robbery, sir. The suspect is my son." Jackson's words cut through the air like a blade. Larson paled. "Sir, I didn't know." Jackson took a slow step forward. "You didn't know," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "So you just assumed?" Larson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Jackson turned to Trevon. His expression softened for just a moment. "Son, are you okay?" Trevon nodded weakly, but his father knew he wasn't. Then, Jackson turned back to Larson. His voice was ice. "You're done." The words hung in the air. Larson's mouth opened in protest, but he seemed to think better of it. "You're fired." Larson stood frozen, his entire world crumbling around him. Jackson ignored him, moving to his son. He knelt in front of Trevon, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Let's go home," he said, his voice firm, but gentle. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Trevon felt safe. As Captain Daryl Jackson led his son out of the interrogation room, the tension in the station was almost suffocating. Officers who had once moved with ease through the halls now stepped aside, their eyes flickering between the boy and the man whose presence commanded authority. Trevon kept his head down, his swollen eyes still burning, his breath uneven, his mind a tangled mess of emotions. Fear, relief, exhaustion. His father's grip on his shoulder was firm, steady, reassuring in a way that no words could be. Trevon felt like he was walking through a fog, his thoughts struggling to catch up with the reality that, just moments ago, he had been treated like a criminal, like someone who didn't deserve basic humanity, all because of the color of his skin and the assumptions that came with it. Jackson stopped at the front desk, his voice low but sharp as he addressed the officer behind it. "I need my son's belongings." The clerk, a younger officer who had clearly heard the commotion, scrambled to comply, his hands fumbling slightly as he retrieved Trevon's backpack. Jackson took it without a word, slinging it over his own shoulder before guiding his son toward the exit. The heavy station doors pushed open and the night air hit Trevon's face like a cool wave, washing away the stale scent of the police station, but not the memory of what had happened inside. The streetlights glowed against the pavement, casting long shadows as Jackson led his son to his car. A sleek black SUV parked just outside. He unlocked the doors, and Trevon climbed in without hesitation, sinking into the passenger seat as if the fabric itself could swallow him whole. He heard his father close the driver's door, but neither of them spoke right away. The engine hummed to life, but Jackson didn't pull away from the curb. Instead, he exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel tightly before turning to face his son. "Trevon," he started, his voice softer than it had been in the station, but still carrying the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Trevon stared out the window, watching as people moved along the sidewalks, as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath his feet. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to relive it, but he knew his father wouldn't let this moment pass without addressing it. "Look at me, son," Jackson said. Reluctantly, Trevon turned his head, meeting his father's eyes. They weren't just angry, they were pained, filled with something deeper, something that went beyond tonight. "I need you to understand something," Jackson said, his jaw tightening. "What happened back there, that should never have happened. But it did, and it wasn't an accident." Trevon swallowed hard. He had known that, had felt it in the way Larson had looked at him, had heard it in the officer's voice when he said, "Your type. You didn't do anything wrong." Jackson continued, his voice steady. "You were just a black boy walking down the street, and that was enough for him." Trevon's fingers curled into fists in his lap, his breath shaky. He had always known the world wasn't fair. His father had warned him. His mother had too. But knowing it and living it were two different things. He had never been afraid of police before. He had grown up seeing his father in uniform, had watched him leave for work every morning believing that the badge meant protection, that it meant fairness. But tonight, none of that had mattered. Larson hadn't seen him as a person, he had seen him as a problem to be handled. I kept thinking, Trevon finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, that no one would believe me. His father's grip on the wheel tightened. They wouldn't have, Jackson admitted, his voice laced with something Trevon had never heard from him before: defeat. If I hadn't walked in, they would have made you confess to something you didn't do. The words hit Trevon like a punch to the chest. He had known it, but hearing his father say it made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. For a moment, silence filled the car. Then Jackson exhaled, running a hand over his face before shifting gears and pulling away from the curb. "We're going home," he said simply. But Trevon could tell there was more to it than that. His father wasn't just talking about the drive. He was talking about the weight they both carried now. The reality that Trevon had crossed a threshold he could never go back from. The ride home was quiet, the streets passing in a blur of headlights and traffic lights. Trevon stared at the city, at the world that had once felt familiar but now felt different, as if something had shifted permanently. His father didn't speak again until they pulled into their driveway. The house dark, except for the porch light his mother always left on when they were out late. As soon as Trevon stepped inside, the warmth of home wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the sterile, suffocating atmosphere of the station. His mother appeared almost instantly, her face tense with worry, her eyes scanning him as if searching for visible wounds. "Baby," she breathed, rushing forward, pulling him into a tight hug. Trevon stiffened at first, but then the tension melted away, and he let himself sink into her embrace, the familiar scent of her perfume grounding him. "What happened?" she demanded, pulling back just enough to study his face. "Who did this to you?" Jackson set Trevon's backpack down on the counter. "Greg Larson," he said, the name dripping with controlled anger. His wife's face darkened. "That rookie?" "Not anymore," Jackson muttered. "I fired him on the spot." Trevon's mother exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "That's not enough." Jackson nodded. "I know." His voice carried a promise, one that Trevon wasn't sure he fully understood yet. His mother cupped Trevon's face gently, her thumb brushing over the drying streaks of tears. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Trevon hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know." It was the truth. She pulled him in for another hug, whispering, "You're home now, baby. You're safe." But was he? As Trevon lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he replayed every moment of that evening over and over again, the way Larson had grabbed him, the way the pepper spray had burned like fire, the way no one on the street had stopped to help, the way the interrogation room had felt like a cage, and most of all, the way his father had looked at him, not just with anger, but with something deeper, a sadness that came from knowing that no matter how high you climbed, no matter how hard you worked, no matter how many good things you did, there would always be people who saw you as nothing more than a suspect. His father had always told him to be careful, to be respectful, to never give anyone a reason to see him as a threat, but tonight had proven that sometimes that didn't matter. Morning came, but Trevon didn't feel like himself. He moved through the house in a daze, his mother watching him carefully, his father making phone calls in his office. Trevon didn't know what would happen next. Would Larson face any real consequences? Would he move to another precinct? Get another job? Hurt someone else? Would Trevon ever walk through his neighborhood without feeling the phantom weight of a police officer's hand on his arm? He didn't have the answers. But as he sat at the kitchen table, his mother setting a plate of pancakes in front of him, his father walking in with a determined look on his face, Trevon realized something. He had survived. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step towards something bigger. A young black woman, the daughter of a Supreme Court judge, was publicly humiliated by police officers inside one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. But what unfolded next was far from what anyone expected. The officers quickly realized their grave mistake, and the events that followed would leave the entire city talking. The restaurant, known as the Ashford, was among the most refined establishments in Atlanta, adorned with intricate decorations, crystal chandeliers dangling elegantly from the high ceilings, and impeccably arranged tables draped in pristine white linens. Talia Monroe stepped through the heavy glass doors, her heels clicking softly on the marble floors. At 25, she moved with grace and quiet pride. Her skin, the color of rich espresso, stood out against her pale pink dress. Simple, elegant, and carefully chosen for the occasion. She had earned this night. Fresh from her first major courtroom victory as a junior attorney, Talia wanted nothing more than a peaceful dinner to celebrate, a small moment of joy after years of hard work. But the room seemed to stiffen as she entered. Conversations dipped. Forks paused midair. Eyes followed her, curious, skeptical, unwelcoming. At the host stand, a young man with slicked-back hair and an expensive smile glanced up, and something cold flickered in his eyes when he saw her. His name tag read Trevor. Talia approached calmly. "Good evening," she said. "Reservation for Monroe, 7 o'clock. Trevor didn't bother to hide his frown. "Are you sure you're at the right place, ma'am?" he said, voice thinly veiled. Talia's smile tightened. She held up her phone. "Confirmed it 2 days ago." Trevor tapped on the screen slowly, almost lazily. "I'm sorry," he said finally, not even pretending to check. "We're fully booked tonight. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere. Less formal." The word less hung in the air like a slap. Talia stood a little straighter. She knew the game. She had seen it before. Growing up, studying law, walking into courtrooms where no one expected a black woman to be the one standing at the front. "I have a reservation," she repeated evenly. A middle-aged woman in pearls and a designer coat standing nearby watched with mild amusement, as if expecting a scene. Trevor's eyes flicked over Talia's dress, her skin, her presence, then turned to the security guard by the door, a large man with arms crossed tight over his chest. "Tom," Trevor called. "Could you assist here?" The security guard approached, his posture aggressive. "Problem, sir?" "No problem," Talia said firmly. "Just trying to be seated." Trevor chuckled humorlessly. "This guest seems confused." Talia's heart pounded with a familiar mix of rage and humiliation. Confused. Troublemaker. Out of place. She had heard them all before, never said outright, but sharp enough to cut. Before she could respond, the situation escalated. 2 police officers who had been sipping coffee at the bar noticed the exchange. Officers Brad Keene and David Morris. They approached with slow, easy confidence, the kind men have when they know the system bends toward them. "What's going on here?" Officer Keene asked, resting his hand casually on his belt. Trevor straightened his spine. "She's refusing to leave after being told there's no table available." "Is that so?" Officer Morris said, eyeing Talia like she was a stray dog wandering into a ballroom. "I'm not refusing," Talia said, her voice steady but tight. "I reserved a table. I have proof." Officer Keene smirked. "I'm sure you do." Without another word, he reached out and grabbed her arm, not hard up her sleeve, but hard enough to make a point. Talia gasped, yanking free instinctively. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You're creating a disturbance," Officer Morris said, his voice louder now, drawing attention. "We're going to need you to leave." Around them, diners stared, some openly, some pretending not to. None intervened. "You're doing this because I'm black," Talia said, her voice breaking through the heavy silence. Officer Keene's lips curled into a smirk. "Careful now. Wouldn't want to make accusations you can't back up." He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The final insult. Talia froze. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. Not after everything she had fought to achieve. "You're making a mistake," she said, barely a whisper. "Sure we are," Keene said mockingly, snapping the cuffs open. But before he could touch her again, the door behind them swung open with a sharp bang. Judge Nathaniel Monroe, Talia's father, entered the restaurant, and the atmosphere changed in an instant. He was an imposing figure, tall, broad, impeccably dressed in a dark suit and a gray wool coat. His eyes, the same deep brown as Talia's, scanned the room with laser focus, landing on the officers, the security guard, and his daughter standing frozen in place. "Unhand my daughter," he commanded, his voice a cold boom that silenced the room. Officer Keene froze mid-motion. Officer Morris took an uneasy step back. Trevor's face went white as linen. Judge Monroe approached slowly, every step radiating authority honed by decades on the bench. "And would one of you," he said, his tone deadly calm, "like to explain to me exactly why you are detaining an innocent woman who did nothing but walk into a restaurant she had every legal right to enter?" No one answered. The silence was deafening. Talia let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of her father's presence steady her. "You will release her," Judge Monroe said, "and you will apologize, publicly, or I will ensure that the fallout from this reaches every corner of this city, and beyond." The weight of Judge Monroe's words hung heavy in the air, and for a long moment, no one moved. Officer Keene slowly lowered the handcuffs, his mouth pressed into a thin, grim line, while Officer Morris shifted awkwardly, clearing his throat but finding no words. Trevor, the manager, seemed rooted to the floor, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled to smooth the front of his jacket. A few diners, emboldened by the dramatic turn, began murmuring louder now, some pulling out their phones to capture the scene that had already become unforgettable. Talia, still feeling the phantom grip of the officer's hand on her arm, blinked back the sting in her eyes and stepped closer to her father, grateful beyond words for his sudden, powerful arrival. Judge Monroe did not waver. His voice remained even, deliberate, cutting through the uncomfortable silence. "Apologize to my daughter. Now." Trevor swallowed hard, stepping forward with the strained mechanical politeness of a man whose career flashed before his eyes. "Miss Monroe, on behalf of the Ashford, I deeply apologize for the misunderstanding," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Officer Keene muttered something barely audible, something that might have been an apology, but sounded more like a growl. It didn't matter. The damage was done, and everyone in that room knew it. Judge Monroe turned slightly, scanning the guests whose expressions ranged from guilty fascination to outright shame. "This," he said, his voice low but fierce, "is what prejudice looks like. This is how dignity is stripped, not with violence, but with small, calculated humiliations." His gaze pinned each officer in place. "You made assumptions about my daughter because of the color of her skin, not because of her actions. Not because of any danger, simply because she dared walk into a space you decided she didn't belong." No one could look away. Without another word, Judge Monroe placed his hand gently on Talia's back and guided her toward the exit. They didn't rush. They didn't slink out in shame. They walked with heads high, a father and daughter refusing to bow to ignorance. As they stepped outside into the cool night, flashes from a few reporters' cameras lit the sidewalk. Somehow, word of the incident had already spread, and local journalists were eager for a story. Microphones thrust forward, questions flying. "Judge Monroe, can you comment on what happened inside? Miss Monroe, were you assaulted? Is there going to be a lawsuit?" Talia hesitated, the chaos buzzing around her like a swarm of bees, but her father touched her arm lightly and nodded. She understood. Facing the cameras squarely, Talia spoke. Tonight I was treated like a criminal for daring to exist in a space that didn't expect someone like me. But I refuse to be silent. I refuse to be shamed. I have done nothing wrong, and no one should have to justify their right to be treated with basic human dignity. Her voice, though soft, carried strength that even the clicking cameras couldn't diminish. Judge Monroe added, "This is not an isolated event. It is part of a larger, deeper sickness we must confront. And we will." The next morning, the story was everywhere. Local news channels aired footage of the confrontation, and the clips quickly spread across social media. Hashtags demanding justice for Talia Monroe trended nationally within hours. Talk shows picked up the story. Radio hosts debated it heatedly. Emails flooded the Ashfords' inbox, some furious, some defensive, many demanding accountability. The restaurant issued a bland public apology, but it did little to stem the growing outrage. Within days, the mayor of Atlanta called Judge Monroe personally, expressing regret and promising an internal review. The police department opened an investigation into Officers Keene and Morris. Both were placed on administrative leave pending disciplinary hearings. Meanwhile, Talia found herself thrust into a role she had not asked for but could not ignore. She began receiving invitations to speak at community meetings, on college campuses, even at rallies organized by civil rights groups. At first, the attention overwhelmed her. She had not sought fame. She had wanted only to celebrate a small personal victory, to enjoy a simple meal in peace. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks, she realized something deeper was unfolding. This wasn't about her alone. It was about every young black person who had been made to feel small in spaces that should have welcomed them. Every sideways glance, every whispered slight, every denied opportunity had led to this moment. With her father's steady support, Talia decided to act. She filed a formal civil rights complaint against the Ashford and the Atlanta Police Department. Her legal team, assembled from allies across the city, included some of the best civil rights attorneys in the South. They crafted a case not just about a ruined evening, but about systemic discrimination, about a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. Talia also began organizing speaking engagements under the banner Right to Dignity, a movement she hoped would spark real conversations about racism in public spaces, not just in courts or classrooms, but in the quiet corners of daily life where bias lived and thrived. At one of her first rallies, standing before a sea of faces, young and old, black and white, Talia shared her story again. But this time, her voice was stronger. "When they tried to make me feel small," she said, "they underestimated me. They underestimated all of us. Because we are not small. We are not invisible. We are not going away." The crowd erupted into applause, and Talia felt something inside her settle. She would not be defined by their hatred. She would define herself, with pride, with power, and with the unbreakable dignity passed down to her from generations who had stood before her. Meanwhile, pressure mounted on the Ashfords' ownership. Several corporate sponsors pulled future event bookings. High-profile figures announced public boycotts. Reviews flooded Yelp and TripAdvisor, each more scathing than the last. It wasn't just about a bad experience anymore. It had become a symbol, a lightning rod in a city still grappling with its deep racial divides. Officer Keene issued a half-hearted apology through his attorney, claiming stress and confusion led to his actions. Few believed him. Officer Morris, more quietly, tendered his resignation, stating he no longer felt comfortable serving in a department that allowed such behavior. And yet, through it all, Talia remained focused not on vengeance but on change. She met privately with the police chief, pushing for better training, for policies that emphasized de-escalation and implicit bias education. She sat on panels with business leaders, challenging them to create truly inclusive spaces. not just inclusive marketing slogans. At every turn, she repeated the same message. Respect is not a privilege. It is a right. Late one evening, weeks after the incident, Talia and her father sat together in his living room, the soft glow of the fireplace warming the space between them. Judge Monroe sipped his coffee thoughtfully before speaking. "You know," he said, "when I walked into that restaurant that night, I thought about how many times I had been the invisible man in rooms just like it. Watching you stand up, I realized something. You're stronger than I ever was at your age." Talia smiled, a small, tired smile, but a real one. "I had a good teacher," she said. He reached over, squeezed her hand gently. "The world's not going to change overnight. But you've cracked something open, Talia. You've given people permission to see what they try so hard to ignore." Outside, the city hummed in the distance, alive with its flaws and its hopes. And inside that quiet room, a young woman who had once been told she didn't belong anywhere realized she had built something bigger than herself. A movement that demanded simply and powerfully the right to belong everywhere. The courtroom buzzed with a low, tense energy as the trial began. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised, their cameras ready to capture every expression, every stumble. On one side sat the legal team representing the Ashford and the officers involved. On the other sat Talia Monroe, flanked by her attorneys and her father, Judge Nathaniel Monroe, who, though not speaking on her behalf in court, was present every day, a silent pillar of strength. The judge presiding over the case, a stern woman named Eleanor Whitmore, wasted no time cutting through the usual pleasantries. She understood the weight of this case. It wasn't just about one young woman's ruined evening. It was about the kind of city Atlanta wanted to be, about whether discrimination could still be brushed aside as a misunderstanding, or if it would finally be called out for what it was. Talia sat straight-backed as her lead attorney, Marcus Holloway, laid out the opening arguments with calm precision. He painted a picture not just of what had happened to Talia, but of a systemic culture that had allowed it to happen, a culture where bias, unchecked and unchallenged, had seeped into every corner of public life, including high-end restaurants and the police force sworn to serve and protect all citizens. On the defense side, their lawyers tried to argue that it was all an unfortunate error, that the officers had acted out of concern for public safety, that the restaurant staff had simply been following protocol. But their words sounded hollow, their justifications stretched thin. The footage from diners' phones played on the courtroom monitors, showing Talia standing calmly, the officers advancing with handcuffs at the ready, the manager smirking nearby. There was no shouting, no threat, no excuse. Talia took the stand on the third day. The courtroom held its breath as she recounted the night, her voice steady but threaded with emotion. She spoke not just of that night, but of the countless small indignities that built up over a lifetime. Stores where she was followed, interviews where she was underestimated, sidewalks where strangers clutched their purses tighter. She spoke for every black girl who had been made to feel lesser in places they had every right to be. When she finished, the courtroom sat in heavy silence, the gravity of her words settling like a stone. Even the defense attorneys looked down, scribbling aimless notes they would never use. In the following days, witnesses took the stand. Patrons from the Ashford described what they had seen. A composed young woman treated like a criminal without cause. Experts on racial bias explained the insidious ways discrimination manifested in everyday interactions. Former employees of the Ashford, emboldened by the spotlight, came forward to describe a culture that subtly but consistently treated black patrons and employees differently. Stories of reservations lost, of tables suddenly unavailables, of black waiters pushed to the back where they would be less visible. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. Throughout it all, Talia remained composed. But inside, a storm raged. There were moments she wanted to scream, moments she wanted to cry, moments she doubted whether standing up had been worth the cost. But every time she looked over and saw her father's steady gaze, she remembered why she had started this journey. Not for revenge, but for dignity, for change, for the generations coming behind her. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the defense grew desperate, throwing out thinly veiled attacks on Talia's character, insinuations that she had been looking for attention, that she had provoked the situation. But the jury, diverse, thoughtful, and deeply aware of the stakes, saw through it. After 2 weeks of testimony, the closing arguments began. Marcus Holloway spoke of accountability, of the chance to send a message that Atlanta would not be a city that turned a blind eye to injustice. He asked the jury to consider not just Talia's night, but the ripple effect of allowing such behavior to go unchecked. The defense, in contrast, leaned heavily on calls for understanding and grace for the officers and the restaurant, painting them as victims of overzealous activism. It was a weak, flailing argument, and it fell flat. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Talia gripped the edge of the table, feeling her father's hand squeeze her shoulder gently. The foreman, a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes, stood and read the verdict. In favor of Talia Monroe. Damages awarded not only for emotional distress but also punitive damages against the Ashford and the Atlanta Police Department. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Tears welled in Talia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not yet. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed the court, and all at once reporters surged forward. But Talia didn't rush to the microphones. She stood slowly, turned to her father, and allowed herself a small, private smile. They had won, not just for her, but for everyone who had been silenced, shamed, or turned away. At the press conference that followed, Talia spoke clearly, powerfully. "This victory isn't mine alone," she said. "It belongs to every person who has ever been made to feel they didn't belong simply because of the way they look. It belongs to the people who came before me and the ones who will come after. This isn't the end. This is the beginning." In the months that followed, tangible changes unfolded. The Ashford announced a complete overhaul of its management and staff training programs, though the public trust was harder to rebuild. The Atlanta Police Department implemented new mandatory anti-bias training, and several officers, inspired by the case, began pushing for broader reforms from within. Talia continued her work with the Right to Dignity initiative, traveling to schools, churches, community centers, speaking not just about what happened to her, but about the larger, deeper roots of racism and the quiet courage it takes to confront it. One evening, standing on a stage at a packed auditorium at Spelman College, Talia looked out at the faces, young, eager, burning with the same fire she had once barely dared to show, and felt a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. "We are not guests in our own country," she said, her voice ringing out. "We are not visitors in spaces our ancestors helped build. We are not trespassers in restaurants, boardrooms, schools, or dreams. We belong, and we will never again ask for permission to exist." The applause thundered around her, not polite, not perfunctory, but roaring with the force of generations demanding finally to be heard. Back home that night, Talia sat by the window, looking out over the city lights. Her phone buzzed with congratulations from friends, from strangers, from people she had never met, but who told her, over and over, that her story had given them courage. Judge Monroe entered the room quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea, and handed her one. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, father and daughter, warriors in the same long battle. Finally, Judge Monroe spoke, his voice soft. "You changed something, Talia." She looked at him, her heart full. "We changed something," she said. And out beyond the window the city breathed, restless and alive, a little more awake, a little more just, because one young woman had refused to be silent.